And welcome to this Maritime London webinar in partnership with Maritime London member GMS. I'm Josh Standerwick, Chief Executive of Maritime London, and I'll be moderating today's session as we explore the role of sustainable recycling in shipping's journey to net zero. I can't imagine that recycling is that high on the agenda for that many ship owners at the moment as freight rates continue to fly high. However, it has long seemed odd to me that whilst there is an insatiable appetite for information on what the future of the fleet may look like and what fuels will be used to power it, the question of how the current fleet is going to be sustainably recycled is not explored to the same degree. No matter which way you cut the cake, a significant percentage of the global fleet will need to be recycled as the industry decarbonises. With the current market conditions leading to ships trading for longer, an influx of new builds coming into the market, and CII potentially making older vessels unviable, although I know this is a much debated point. As a colleague mused with me the other day, are we heading for a perfect storm, and what may the implications be for the industry? This session will explore what the current market conditions are and what the medium-term outlook may look like, how the ship recycling market is moving towards a more sustainable future, and a view from a ship owner and their considerations when it comes to what has become coined as the circular economy, and a view of the complex regulatory landscape facing ship owners as they plan out the life cycle of their vessels. Joining me today, we've got Dr. Anand Hirmath, Chief Sustainable Officer at GMS, Simon Bennett, General Manager Sustainable Development at Swire Shipping, and James Clayton, Director at law firm CJC. Before we get started, just a quick run through of some housekeeping notices. This is a live webinar, and while of course we don't anticipate any technological issues, they do occasionally happen, and if they do, please do bear with us. This session is also being recorded and will be shared with participants and those who have registered for the event after the session. You are absolutely welcome to ask questions. If I could ask you to put them in the Q&A area rather than the chat, that will help us make sure that we understand where the questions are, and we'll look to answer as many as we can throughout the session. However, of course, we are on a tight time frame, so apologies in advance if we cannot field all of them. I think that's probably everything from me for now. So I'd now like to pass over to Anand from GMS, who will kick proceedings off with a presentation. Anand, over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants. In this webinar, we are going to discuss about the role of sustainable recycling in shipping's journey to net zero. Well, the topic itself says the shipping's journey to net zero, the role of sustainable recycling. First, it's important to understand what is ship recycling and when it becomes sustainable. The first and foremost point is the ship recycling is the fourth pillar of shipping. If we consider ship building, ship repair, ship operation as the other three pillars. Recycling, whether it is ship recycling or any other type of recycling, it is already a sustainable activity. But when it comes to ship recycling, if we do the ship recycling in safe and environment friendly manner, it will be called as sustainable recycling. But in the context of net zero, if we produce the steel generated by a ship recycling process with less carbon emissions, it will be called as sustainable recycling. So it all depends on the perspective we are looking at. If you look at ship recycling, it's already contributing to in reduction of carbon emissions. As you may know, ship recycling, more than 97% of the materials are either reused, repaired, and repurposed and recycled. This is one of the best example for circular economy. The carbon footprint of steel generated from ship recycling is quarter of producing steel from iron ore process. We, under our program, Sustainable Ship and Offshore Recycling Program, do estimate the carbon footprint of each ship we supervise when it comes for recycling. Giving an example of recent ship which we did an estimation for carbon footprint, it was an oil tanker of having an LDT of 29,000 plus metric tons. Recycling of this ship, right from cutting at the ship recycling yard and producing the steel bars and steel ingots at the re-rolling and re-electric arc furnace, contributed to 9,700 plus metric ton of CO2 emissions. We have recovered 29,000 plus ton of steel, but the same amount of steel, if you would have recovered from the conventional process, that iron ore mining, then the emission could have been 40,000 metric ton CO2 equivalent. What it means? It means by recycling ship, we saved 30,000 plus metric ton of CO2 equivalent GHG emissions. When it comes to capacity and capability, considering an example of India, India has around 93 ship recycling yards which are already compliant with Hong Kong Convention Statement of Compliance. The Statement of Compliance is issued by different classification societies, for example, Class NK, Indian Registry of Shipping, Lloyd's Register, Bureau Veritas, and RINA. The total capacity as on today is 4.5 million metric ton per year. For example, we can recycle easily 450 ships per year, and it is expected to increase to 9.2 million metric ton capacity by the year 2030. You can say by the year 2030, as per the government of India's plan, there will be nearly 200 ship recycling yards in India, able to accumulate 50% of the total scrap ships generated globally per year. And it comes to acceptability, all types of ships, size, and offshore units are acceptable for recycling in India. Well, what we get when we recycle a ship? When we recycle a ship, we get more than 85% of the steel. Steel is the main product we get from recycling. Apart from that, we'll get furniture and fixtures, the machineries, non-ferrous materials. This is one of an example of a 10,000 ton ship, say a container ship. When we recycle this, we get this much material. Well, if you look at the inception, what the ship recycling industry in Alang has contributed for the sustainability, 8,500 plus ships are recycled till date, recovering 67 million tons of steel. If you can build 9,077 Eiffel Towers with that steel recovered, or we can say it is equivalent to saving 9 years of daily New York City's power consumption. By recycling ships and by recovering wood from that particular process, we say that in last 40 years, nearly 142,000 tons of wood has been recovered, which is equivalent to 1258 football field of trees. If you would have saved cutting this much amount of trees, these trees would have captured 4,293 plus tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, we know that we have enough capacity for sustainable recycling. But what is the shipping goal is right now? The decarbonization goal for the ship owners, first they are looking at efficiencies. The ship owners are looking into different technologies to increase the efficiency of their engines. They're working for different fuel options, maybe an LNG or some other options. They are also worried about the suitability. The vintage assets might not be able to fit in the new upcoming regulation, which is EEXI and CII from the IMO, which is going to start from January 2023. But when we did some research on the published materials from the scientific journals, based on that research, we could able to see that the ultimate aim of EEXI and CII is to save environment, save the GHG emissions. But this might put certain vintage assets to go for recycling. Well, if the ships go for recycling, the new building has to be done. So the new building of ship is found to be more environmentally damaging than continuing the life of vintage assets. Let me give an example. We expect existing fleet of bulker and VLCC vessels to most probably not meet the IMO regulations, EEX and CII. So we might need to build new ships. If the ship has to be built, we need steel. And if every ton of steel produced now in the conventional method will produce 1.85 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced, and we know that nearly 6 to 8% of global CO2 emissions is coming from the steel industries all over the world. It takes around 770 kg of coal to make 1 ton of steel, with approximately 70% of the global steel produced in basic oxygen furnace. For example, if you want to build a ship of 20,000 metric tons, it requires nearly 15.4 million tons of coal and will produce 37 tons of CO2. This is a rough estimation. This is not a complete life cycle assessment, but it also includes certain aspects such as VOCs, volatile organic carbon, which might release during the painting operations, which equates to around 175 metric tons. One can argue that the new building ships will go, with the new fuel and most likely LNG. Most of them will significantly reduce the emissions, but the use of LNG does not decrease the global warming potential more than 8 to 20%. The reduction amount depends mainly on the magnitude of the methane which escapes from the engine. Also, a great deal of energy is consumed for gasification and transportation of these liquids, includes a lot of emissions. When we did a study in ship recycling yards, when as you usually do an carbon footprint estimation for each ship, the dismantling at shipyard for any ship contributes to only 4% of the total GHG emissions. And over 95% of the GHG emissions were observed in the re-rolling mills and electric arc furnaces. And 1% is contributed by transportation of steel plates from ship recycling yard to re-rolling mills, or the waste from ship recycling yard to the waste disposal facilities, or the reusable materials from yard to the second-hand selling yards. So the major uh, contribution of GHG emissions in ship recycling activity is re-rolling mills and electric arc furnaces. In one of the research I was studying, and then I come with one of the paper published, with the name assessing environmental impacts of ships from a life cycle perspective. And this particular study has been done on a Panamax ship, considering its building, operation, and risk, and also considered the recycling aspects of it. And the results shows that the shipbuilding has 40% impact, and steel production process under the scope of shipbuilding alone is responsible for nearly 90% of the CO2 emissions. So how we can become circular and to make the real purpose of EEXI and CII to serve? First is to consume less, second is to consume better, and to have the create a systematic change. When I say a systematic change, we know that there are several technologies, there are several softwares in the market, and people are working on efficiencies, to reduce the emissions. But whether those technologies are feasible, whether those technologies are appropriate. When I say appropriate, it means it has to be acceptable, affordable, and manageable. So the affordability of those technologies is the question. And when we make an regulation, the life cycle perspective has to be considered, and our regulations should not be counterproductive. And in the quest of saving certain emissions in one place, we should not end up emitting more emissions in the other process. So the key takeaways here is sustainable recycling is already, we have enough capacity, enough experience, and the sustainable recycling is possible. There is no worry about that. The main purpose to meet the circular economy context is to extend the life of a ship, because ship recycling is inevitable. One or the other day, the ship definitely will come for recycling. But extending the life of the ship as practicable as possible with the minimum technologies is the need of the hour. And as we discussed earlier, that more than 97% of the material is anyway directly reused, refurbished from recycling. Sustainable recycling is already in place. And as a carbon footprint and as well as a compliance monitoring team, we believe that a lot of research and development is especially required in re-rolling mills and electric arc furnaces. If we further want to reduce the emissions, already the ship recycling, if you produce steel, 1 ton of steel from recycling, it is one quarter, almost one fourth of the steel produced from conventional steel making. But however, if we want to further reduce it, the main innovation is required in re-rolling mills, and electric arc furnaces. We need to make them more energy efficient. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, Jose.
Anand, thank you for that presentation. There was an awful lot of statistics in there, so rest assured, viewers, that you will be able to access that on the recording and take fully in what Anand was saying all the way through. And one thing that struck me in the presentation is the fact that there are 93 yards now HKC compliant in India. Obviously, a lot of people bemoan the fact that HKC is slow in ratification, I suppose. But it seems to me that its mere existence is already changing the standards within significant amounts of yards on the subcontinent. Is that a fair appraisal?
Well, I agree with you, Jose, that the change which HKC was supposed to make, it's already making at the ground. It's only the is matter of ratification which is remaining, which Bangladesh or China holds a key for ratification. and already we have 17 countries which have already ratified when we have met the first condition of HKC, and the second and third condition will only be met if Bangladesh or China ratifies it. The HKC ratification is quite tricky, and when the regulation was made, it was made considering that the ship recycling yards in the subcontinent will be a part of it. So anybody can, today you ask, the major ship registry company countries, they are ready to ratify it, but if they ratify it, the second and third condition will not be met. So it's important that Bangladesh and or China ratifies it as quick as possible.
Mm. And just building on some of the stats that you put there, we've got a question in from Kia, and I think this is really alluding to a further piece of regulation, which is of course impacting on the recycling industry, the HMM code. And he asks, how does the presence of hazardous substances and materials affect the amount of recoverable and recyclable material from the asset?
Well, the total quantity of hazardous material will not be more than 0.1% of the total LDT of the ship.
Right.
So the quantity of hazardous materials compared to the total size of a ship is minimal, and we have enough standard operating procedures and in place, and there is a dedicated hazardous waste storage facility in ship recycling yards, for example, in India, which takes all the hazardous waste coming out from ship.
And before we open up to the main panel, just on the presentation, it feels to me that sort of GMS are of a view that CII should or could mean that actually assets will be traded for longer, etc. And actually potentially we won't see the influx of new builds coming into the market that some analysts predict as a consequence of CII. However, if that outlook proves not to be right, you also seem to suggest that there was almost infinite capacity within recycling yards globally. Is that a fair appraisal, or are we going to have to see new yards coming online as a consequence to deal with the potential extra demand? Maybe not in 3-4 years time, but in 10-15 years time, perhaps. And as an addendum to that, I suppose, how is would an influx of ships needing to be recycled in any way affect the market for recycled steel?
Well, we believe that, and it's a fact that the entire ship recycling market is not driven by the steel prices. It all depends on the freight rates actually.
Yeah.
When the freight rate is not good, the ships come for recycling. So it's not about the steel prices at the end. It's all about the freight rates, which are significantly contributing to everything. If you can see the last quarter, we hardly seen any ship coming for recycling because the freight rate is really good. And coming to your question, we do have enough capacity already. And as I said, by 2030, the ship recycling capacity is going to be doubled. There is enough capacity available. But what is believed is like when we know and everybody knows that ship recycling is inevitable. The ships will come for recycling, and it's good for us when it comes for recycling. But when the entire world believes on circular economy and believes on carbon emission savings, so it's important that the end of life ships are utilized to their full potential before they are sent for scrap.
Anand, thank you for that. We have an interesting question from Alberto, but I think we might come to that a little bit later on in the webinar, perhaps. Simon, from your perspective, obviously Swires is what could be defined as a premium owner, and I doubt that you send too many vessels directly to recycling yards. However, given this, does the future of the ship recycling market and the regulation which is coming into place present you with many concerns, I suppose? And how do you consider the full life cycle of the vessel when making new build or purchase decisions?
Okay, there's a number of questions there. Since I've been involved with sustainability, and recycling comes under that area, we sent 4 ships to China before 2016 when they banned foreign ships, and since then another 11 whilst we've been involved in retonnaging the fleet. So that's a fairly significant amount of tonnage. recycling, well, the only option we have, the only legal option we have, is to recycle a ship. The London Dumping Convention bans you from taking it out to the middle of the ocean and sinking it. And recycling, leading to a closed loop economy, is by far the most efficient way of dealing with it, as Anand has mentioned, and as we ourselves have measured. A good 98.85% by weight of the ships that we have recycled have been reused, whether they've been recycled, upcycled, re-rolled, etc. for the steel, and then you include the mattresses and the turbochargers and the portholes, etc. So you have to recycle the ship. What we have said is we will ensure it is done in accordance with a global standard, the Hong Kong Convention. It doesn't need to be, it'd be nice if it was ratified and adopted by the requisite number of states, but you can use that as a standard, as a globally accepted, negotiated, discussed, and agreed at the conference in Hong Kong. You can use that standard to recycle your ship. We then would put a monitoring team in place with the full agreement of the recycling yards, thus far only in India. And even though we don't own the ship when it is being recycled, and this is a paradigm shift, the recycling yards in India that we have used accept, and everyone in the yard is aware, that our team of 3 has the full responsibility and authority to stop any work that they think is going to harm people or the environment. And that has been proven over and over again. That's been allowed to happen. Whatever the issue was has been resolved, and then the recycling is carried on. So it can be done safely and environmentally responsibly. And that was a long answer, and I've forgotten the third question.
I mean, I think that the last part of that really was in terms of, how does the recycling element or the full life cycle of the vessel impact on Swire's new build or purchase decisions?
Okay, we are certainly aware of it. We are lobbying through organisations as hard as we can for alternate and low carbon fuels to be treated from a whole of life cycle perspective, which has not been adopted yet by IMO, but we have high hopes of it being adopted. Otherwise, you'll just get leakage and you won't achieve everything you need to achieve. We are watching what's going on with Steel Zero, which has set itself up to reduce that part of the ship building and recycling part of the life cycle. The steel manufacturers are aware of the issues and are working in that area. We are aware of the different carbon footprints of electric arc recycling against cold rolling. So it is an area that we are aware of. We actually finished our retonnaging some years ago. We are looking to build 1 or 2 vessels going forwards, but the shipbuilding prices are not conducive to ordering a ship at the moment. As they begin to come off, because the freight rates are beginning to come off, then that will be more viable. And we will certainly, at that time, when we order further new vessels, we will be measuring the whole of life cycle carbon footprint of the next class of vessels that we order.
Yeah, and Anand, just to quickly segue back to you, Simon mentioned the fact that Swire are now insistent on using HKC compliant yards for their vessels, but also an interesting point, and this is not something I've picked up on before, and of course we don't have a yard sort of representative here, but I'm sure GMS are involved in these conversations in some way. Is it now becoming a norm that beyond class coming in and ensuring that yards are HKC compliant, etc., that owners are actually sending in their own independent teams to assess the recycling of their vessels? Is that a significant shift in the market?
Well, yes, that's not, we cannot call it a significant shift, but I mean, Swire was one of the pioneer in that. Right from their first ship, they started compliance monitoring team, and that's what I do. I mean, in fact, we under SSGMS we have our own sustainable ship and offshore recycling program, and we have done compliance monitoring for over 100 ships now in last 7 years, and this is something has become a common trend where the ship owner wants to send their own representatives to ensure the recycling is being done in line with the requirements of HKC. As Simon rightly mentioned, that these compliance monitoring teams have been given enough freedom to stop the work, and they can come back to the ship owner, to the yard owner, that if they find anything which is in line, not in line with the ship recycling plan, which is harming, any activity harming, can has a potential to harm the workers or the environment, they can immediately stop it until and unless it is rectified. So that's what we do. I mean, we are into compliance monitoring, and that's a common thing now. Every ship owner is looking for it.
Can I just come back on that? The previous situation was totally illogical, that we would order a ship to be built somewhere, it doesn't matter where. That ship is not owned by us at the time, but we send 6 superintendents there to look at the engineering and the hull and the paint, etc. So we have a vested interest in the ship being built. Then it's delivered and we operate it for 25 or 30 years, and we have a vested interest, so we have more superintendents looking after it. And at the end of its economic life, we go, okay, well, that's it. Nothing to do with us anymore. Take it away. We have an equal responsibility at the end of a ship's life to make sure that it is responsibly and sustainably recycled, and it doesn't harm people and it doesn't harm the environment during that process. So I don't understand why ship owners would only be involved in the first 2 stages and then wash their hands for the 3rd stage. It's illogical.
Simon, that's an interesting point, and I think it sort of presents quite a good time to bring James into this conversation. James, I think we've already touched on a few items of the sort of changing regulatory landscape in the conversation thus far. And of course, Simon's point in that owners should be involved in the whole life cycle of the vessel, from ordering to recycling. Of course, if you are an EU owner, as I understand it, the Basel Ban Amendment almost ensures that you have to be involved in the full life cycle of the vessel. From a CJC perspective, perhaps you could just quickly provide a top-level overview of the regulatory landscape within the recycling market, and then perhaps talk to a few of the issues presented, particularly with EU-based ship owners in the context of the Basel Ban.
Sure. It's a very big topic, so I will try and keep it as short and sweet as possible. But, our other panelists have touched on this, and there's a sort of complex and ever-changing regulatory framework in relation to ship recycling, and a lot of top-down efforts so far to attempt to regulate this space. And kind of, you need to look at sort of international and EU together. So to begin with, I'll look at the sort of the international laws applicable to the disposal of waste, which it being commonly agreed that a ship is considered waste for the purpose of these regulations. So you have the Basel Ban, the Basel Convention and the Basel Ban Amendment, which came into effect in 1992 and applies internationally, and it's been adopted by 190 countries so far, notably not the United States, which has the overarching objective of protecting human health, the environment, against the adverse effect of hazardous wastes. It requires ship waste to be managed and disposed of in an environmentally friendly way, and to minimise the transportation of these wastes, which essentially prohibits the export of hazardous waste from OECD to non-OECD countries, and very notably, the Indian subcontinent nations are all in the latter, and applies as soon as that decision to recycle a ship is made. Now, the Basel Ban was transposed into EU law by the European Union Waste Shipment Regulation, which applies to all non-EU flagged ships which are being imported or exported into or from the EU for recycling. The Ship Recycling Regulation, which I'll get onto in a second, deals with EU flagged vessels. But again, the Waste Shipment Regulation requires consent from the exporting and importing states, and much like the Basel Convention, prescribes a sort of an outright ban on the transboundary movement of waste from OECD to non-OECD. And then, so that's the disposal of waste. And then you have international law, which relates to the scrapping of ships. So for non-EU flagged ships, you've got the Hong Kong Convention, which we've talked about and everyone will know, which was adopted in 2009, but is not yet in force. And as was mentioned, I think by Anand, 17 states have exceeded, and was the first piece of sort of regulation to sort of adopt this cradle-to-cradle approach, and was developed with input from the IMO, relevant NGOs, in cooperation with the sort of the International Labour Organization and the parties to the Basel Convention, and was that first move towards really acknowledging this principle of a circular economy, and is aimed at ensuring that sort of ships are recycled at the end of their operational lives and don't pose any unnecessary risks to human health, safety, environment, and addresses the ships around ship recycling, containing hazardous materials, as well as also the working conditions and environmental conditions at many of the world's ship recycling locations. And the key requirements, which most people will know of this, are vessels having to carry the inventory of hazardous materials, the IHM, as well as ship recycling facilities having to provide a sort of ship recycling plan when they're scrapping a vessel. Which then finally leads me on to probably the most potent regulation, because it is actually in force, which is the European Ship Recycling Regulation, which came into force in 2018 and is essentially the only legal framework in place which is dedicated to regulating ship recycling and setting requirements for ship recycling facilities. So this applies to EU flagged vessels trading worldwide, and largely reflects the requirements of the Hong Kong Convention. It does include some additional safety, environmental and standards. So again, like Hong Kong, it restricts the use of hazardous materials on ships, and all EU flag vessels are required to have on board an IHM, which is regularly checked. And vessels can then also be only scrapped at a yard contained on a list of approved recycling facilities, which most notably, again, there is no yards on the Indian subcontinent, which is included on this EU list, despite some actually having been approved by the Hong Kong Convention. And for the Anglophiles amongst us, that has also been given domestic effect in the UK for UK ships as well. But just to your point about the sort of liability perspective, and I'm sure we'll get onto this a bit more in detail, that disposal of waste regulations I started off with, so the waste shipment and the Basel Convention, differs from the scrapping of ship regulations. The disposal of waste regulations apply right until the end of the ship recycling process. So you are liable until all that waste has been dealt with. However, under the scrapping of ship regulations, you're only responsible up to the point of sale to a third party yard, cash buyer, and thereafter it is their responsibility. And when sort of the various other panelists touched on it, there's a sort of dissatisfaction with the regulations that are currently in place. So there's been a sort of call to evidence and consultation plan for the end of this year, due to this dissatisfaction with the situation, because essentially the ship recycling regulation has affected prices for EU flagged vessels, and I'm sure Anand can talk much more about this, so that the difference in value for an EU approved yard is half of what could be obtained in a Hong Kong Convention approved yard in India, which doesn't to any owner reflect the cost of compliance, and due to lack of current capacity at EU approved yards, they can simply name their price. So, and I'm sure we will touch on this a bit more, on this sort of debate on why yards can't be approved under the ship recycling regulation, to try and resolve this issue of capacity and pricing, because, you know, Anand will be able to speak much more to this about what is being done by yards to address some of these concerns, but it's going to need buy-in from the EU. So I think that was all the points.
You are on mute, Jose.
Sorry about that. I was just saying, in regards to the EU legislation on ship recycling, is it only if a ship has ever flown an EU flag, or does it have to be flying an EU flag at the time of recycling?
So there is the it all comes down to in relation to the waste shipment regulation in particular, is when the decision is made to recycle the vessel. So if the decision is made to recycle the vessel at the time it was flying an EU flag, then the regulations will apply to them, and that has come up in sort of litigation in various cases where that has, people have had to go look through records and look through correspondence and emails of companies as to exactly when that decision to recycle a vessel was made. And if that was made at a time when the vessel was EU flagged, then even if you reflag the vessel out onto a non-EU flag to a cash buyer or something, it doesn't remove your liability in that respect.
Yeah. And Anne, just to move on to you and to build onto this point, the Basel Convention. So what are the reasons behind HKC compliant yards on the subcontinent not being compliant in accordance with the EU legislation?
Well, Joe's 20 ship recycling yards in India, which are already HKC compliant, applied to EU in the year 2017 or 2018 to be included in the EU list of ship recycling regulation, out of which 4 or 5 yards have been audited. Two few yards have been audited twice, follow-up audits and all. But fortunately or unfortunately, the Basel Convention came into picture, and now EU itself is not clear whether to follow Basel ban amendment or follow their EU ship recycling regulation, because as James rightly said, that in the year 2006, the Basel Convention is adopted as a EU waste shipment regulation by the EU. And when they saw that this regulation is not able to control the flow of ship of EU flagged or non-EU owners sending their ships to beaching yards, then in the 2013 European Union ship regulation was made. But it is to be noted that the European Union ship recycling regulation was made to ensure the HKC is ratified quickly. However, before the HKC is ratified, EU SRR came into force. Now, even though the yards have done an excellent job, the gaps which the EU auditors have identified, mainly on the downstream waste management, the hospital facilities and all, the yard and the government both are working to fill those gaps. But however, there is no response from the European Commission because they themselves are not clear to follow EU SRR or to follow their Basel ban amendment. So this is the problem.
That's interesting. So it feels to me, and you're almost sort of suggesting that in some instances it's almost a bureaucratic delay on the EU side, which is preventing quite a small number of yards, I think it's fair to say, in the subcontinent becoming Basel compliant. Is that a fair summation of your comment?
So if you can simple it down, break it down, it's very simple. With EU SRR, they were planning to include non-OECD countries, the good yards in India, Bangladesh or Pakistan. Say in India first to start with, the plan was to include the Indian yards in the EU list. It was fine. It is still fine according to European Union ship recycling regulation. But because in 2019 or 2020, Basel ban amendment came into force, which clearly says from OECD country we cannot send ships to non-OECD country. This is where the problem is. Now USRR says they can include, but now with Basel ban amendment they cannot include any yards, Indian yards, or any non-OECD country yards.
I think I understand, although I've got to admit my head is a little bit fried, but I think that just shows some of the complexity and the overlapping nature of the regulation that currently exists.
Exactly.
I mean, obviously, Simon, from your perspective, the majority of Swire's businesses are based in the Far East, trading vessels within the Pacific. You probably fall outside of the clutches, if you like, of Basel in the majority of respects. But is it a consideration in the decisions which you make?
Yes, we do operate some 40 ships in the Pacific Island countries and territories, the Pacific Ocean Basin. We have no ships which are EU flagged. They're all Far East flagged. So we do fall outside the EU regulations. We do, as a corporate philanthropic initiative, transfer waste, both hazardous waste and non-hazardous waste, from the middle of the Pacific out to the Pacific Rim for recycling. So that is transboundary carriage of waste streams. And as far as we're concerned, that is not banned under the Basel Convention, providing that you get a shipping country approval and a consignee country approval, and approval if you're stopping in other countries' ports on the voyage, you get their approval as well. There is a similar convention in the Pacific called the Waigani Convention, which is modelled on the Basel Convention, and we work very closely with the Secretariat for that, based in Samoa, and we will not ship any hazardous waste or non-hazardous waste without the certification in place. So it is possible to do it outside the specifics of the EU ship recycling regs. It's possible to do it with waste. New Zealand sent a frigate, sorry, not a frigate, an auxiliary vessel from New Zealand to India for recycling, fully in compliance with all the regulations that they were aware of at the time. It took them a year to get all the approvals, and maybe Ministry of Defence has got time to get those approvals, which maybe a commercial company would rather not do, but they showed it was possible for a country to move one of their own ships to a recycling yard in India. So there are ways to do it without reflagging at sea and changing the name and sort of finding devious ways around the regulations. It is possible to do it under the regulations if you're not closely tied to the EU. So that has tended not to be a concern for us. We still ensure that if there are regulations covering the movement of a ship at the end of its economic life, that we obey all those regulations.
I think, Simon, thanks for that, and that was really interesting. And James, just moving back to you, I mean, Swires have taken the sort of, if you like, recycling plus approach to their life cycle decisions. Obviously, shipping is a fragmented market, and you deal with CJC owners of all shapes and sizes making commercial decisions all the time. When it comes to the guys that and girls that you deal with, I mean, what are the primary queries that you receive, particularly of owners making purchase decisions or new build decisions when it comes to recycling regulation?
I mean, life cycle is important to owners, no matter what the size. In the sense of new builds, they're always going to consider a life cycle when ordering a vessel. You know, decisions made during the design phase and the ordering phase have a great impact on the overall life cycle of a vessel. And owners only want to invest capital into assets which are future-proofed for as long as possible. And then, you know, which will obviously maximise their profitability of the vessel in the short term, and obviously once they come around to selling the vessel in the future, unless they plan on trading it from cradle to grave, which is we often find quite rare. Sort of on the second hand S&P side, you know, it gets a bit more interesting. I mean, owners can't really ignore that, the remaining life cycle of the vessel, as it dictates the vessel's earning potential and how much residual value will be left before they consider purchasing second-hand tonnage. So, I mean, a lot of that clients have the appetite to trade vessels until it needs to be scrapped and then obtain the best rate at the time in line with applicable regulations. But for others, they're simply looking to what rate of return they can get during the vessel's active lifespan, with no real desire to scrap the vessel themselves. So it kind of comes down a lot to their sort of appetite to risk, market fluctuations, and their intended employment of the vessel. I mean, often the biggest thing that dictates it is the vessel's next large capital expenditure, so an upcoming periodical dry docking, and weighing this up against the cost of steel price and, as Anand spoke about earlier, the freight rates. So, often you'll find clients near the end of the life cycle of the vessel, will be trading spot and always keeping an eye on the freight rates and steel price to make sure they get a good deal.
So, I mean, as Anand said earlier, I suppose, the freight rate drives everything, and owners will navigate the regulatory landscape whilst they consider it throughout the life cycle of the vessel, as and when they need to do it, I suppose, rather than sort of the need to recycle sustainably driving commercial decisions.
I would certainly say that those, for sort of more publicly orientated owners or owners of certain sizes, they are certainly factors which need to be taken into account with your stakeholders at large, your investors, and you certainly need to do that. But I would say, as it stands, a lot of owners, they come to us when they have queries. A lot of them want to know about the regulatory framework and what rules apply to them, considering the factual nexus. So, the place of jurisdiction of the owner and its shareholders, the flag state of the vessel, the location of the vessel, where the vessel trades. And, all of this can basically lead to an owner being in doubt as to what rules actually apply to them. And we come in and help them navigate that framework. But I would say, with the sort of ever increasing spectre of reputational risk and personal liability that you are seeing, a lot of owners are putting much more attention on the regulatory space now, because there's increasing concern. Many recent examples. The sea trade case demonstrated EU members states' willingness to bring claims under the recycling regulations. In that instance, it was a breach of the waste shipment regulation, and you had company executives who were personally fined by the Dutch authorities for selling 4 reefer vessels for scrap in the subcontinent. And then another sort of slightly more vague example is the Eurus London, where you had the former beneficial owners who reached an out-of-court settlement with a Bangladeshi steel cutter who sustained injury whilst he was taking the vessel apart in a Bangladeshi yard. Now, this steel cutter brought a claim in the English High Court against the company, despite the fact that they were not the registered owner of the vessel and had sold the vessel to a cash buyer pre-recycling. And this claim was essentially brought on the basis that the company knew or ought to have known that there was a foreseeable risk of harm to workers when they sold the ship to the Bangladeshi yard through a cash buyer. Now, no judgment in that was handed down, but it's one of those things where it's very interesting to note whether such claims will become prevalent in English courts. It suggests that even with the presence of an intermediary cash buyer, a determined and financed claimant could create litigation risk for owners. So, you're seeing these sort of the market, the sort of the landscape changing in relation to liability for this and people being held accountable, which is obviously a good thing. And so it is bringing that, doing it by the book, much more into the forefront of owners' minds, I would say.
James, thanks for that. And just building on this, and it's on what you've said, and there's a couple of bits in the chat which we should probably pay reference to. Anand, from your perspective, obviously the ship recycling market is fragmented, and there are differing standards from jurisdictions and from yards to yards. But it feels to me, from what we've heard from Simon, from what we've heard from James, and yourself, of course, is that whilst it is an iterative process, so to speak, the pressures being placed on owners to make sustainable recycling decisions is moving into such an extent that it will bring up the yards in Bangladesh and Pakistan eventually to a similar standard that we see, or a similar standard that we're seeing in India. Is that a fair appraisal of the landscape at the moment?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the growth is already been seen in the Bangladeshi yards. The growth has already started. One yard in the Bangladesh already got compliance with HKC from the best class in the world. So few yards are already in the pipeline. So it will not be a surprise if more yards within this year can get an SOC from different classes, because that's how it should be. But whether there is a shape, there is a currency issue, but there should be a continual improvement. Ultimately, this is what the industry stands for. And whether it is India, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, still a long way to go. But of course, after India, Bangladesh is going to be the green recycling destination.
And just building on that, we've got a question in the chat from Patrick, and this might be tricky, and I'm not sure whether you're going to be able to do it, Anand. So apologies for putting you on the spot, but how significant is the cost to bring a yard into or up to HKC convention standards? Does it represent a significant amount of expenditure for yards to become HKC compliant?
Well, it all depends on the size of the yard, to be frank. I mean, if the yard is quite huge, the infrastructure cost will be high. It all depends on the kind of equipment the yard is going to purchase. So the HKC process is not just the infrastructure development; it also includes a huge work on human resource development, especially the training of workforce. Infrastructure, anybody can build it, but if one don't know how to follow the state safety operations, if the workers are not trained to do safe practices, then there is no use of infrastructure. It might, it depends. It might cost. I have seen the yards in where they could able to pump in nearly $1 million to upgrade the yard, and even I have seen the yards who have done an HKC compliance, less than $500,000. So it varies from yard to yard, to be frank.
But as we said, I mean, it feels like to me it's fast becoming a sort of a commercial imperative for yards to try and get that HKC compliance, which can only be a good thing for the industry in general, I suppose. And just building on that, and it's an interesting question from a market perspective. And you were saying that by 2030 yards will double in capacity, but we've got a question here from Richard Barrett, and it's sort of maybe sort of counter to that. Obviously, as you say, there are not many ships going for recycling at the moment, and whilst I'm sure that there is quite a significant backlog in a lot of yards, is there a danger that we're actually going to see a reduction of capacity in the short term? Particularly if the freight rates sort of stay where they are or near where they are in the medium term, I suppose.
Well, there is no question of that, because last 4 to 5 months we hardly seen any ships. So if you look at ship recycling yards in Alang, more than, if in my assessment, 70% of the yards are empty. I mean they are waiting for the ships. There is no problem with the capacity at any time, because we have already 4.5 million ton recovery capacity, and I rightly said, at any given point of time, as on today, Alang can take 450 ships per year. So in the short term, even there is a flood of ships, Alang can take it with no problem, because the most of the yards are empty as of now.
And I think we've asked sort of Patrick's question from the yards perspective, but Simon, and then I'll push on to James as well. What's your view on the voluntary compliance question, I suppose?
From a ship owner's point of view, the first few ships that we sent to Alang with full compliance teams, and we also had class in attendance, both on planned or announced visits and surprise visits. It cost us, we lost about 15% of the achievable sale price if we'd just gone to any old yard. We don't care, we wash our hands of it. It did seem a little to us in the beginning, as one of the early proponents of doing it in accordance with Hong Kong Convention, that all the yards seem to be seeking to recover and I've heard the figure of $1 million US mentioned previously. They seem to want to recover that from all the ships which appeared in the first couple of years, which was a little bit naughty. But that was the cost of doing business the way we wish to do business. There's two types of ship owners out there. It's not the good guys and the bad guys, but it's those who feel willing or able or prompted to put a value on their reputation, and those who really don't care. Is how I would divide the two up. The 15% loss on sale price doesn't mean much because it depends on the size of your ship and what the steel price was the day the contract was signed. I would say that one thing that we watch, but we don't make commercial decisions on the steel price, because in general we have a ship coming up to its 4th, 5th, 6th special, and the decision that we make is do we pay to get it through its special, the next special, which obviously becomes progressively more expensive as the ship gets older, or with the freight rates as they are, do we continue to trade it? The achievable steel price isn't really a big concern because it is what it is on that day. I think now, when I think the figure was 93 yards are HKC compliant, the compliance cost to us on the sale of a ship is around about $250,000, 200,000 US dollars maybe, including class, including my visits to the yards, and including the compliance monitoring team. But that is not seen as a nice to have. That's seen as a need to have. That is what we will do, and that is what many other owners will decide that they need to do. But then it depends whether you're recycling a super tanker or a passenger ship or a handy size, as to how much of a percentage that is on the total sale price. And the yards, again, I'm not a yard owner, but the yards are able to turn on and off pretty much at the flick of a switch, because a large percentage of the labor is on a day rate. That in itself causes problems for the yards, because they can offer all this training to a cutter or a crane driver or whatever. You don't know that he will turn up the following day with the training you paid for. So it involves a commitment from the yard to do the right thing going forwards, and it involves commitments from the owners to support where they can. It's a symbiotic relationship.
And James, it's been James, it's been slightly remiss of us, I suppose. I mean, we've focused very much on the yards and ship owners in this webinar, and we only have a minute left. However, just on that voluntary compliance point, I suppose, what sort of pressures are coming from financiers, or are there any pressures coming from financiers, capital providers in regards to this question? And are they pushing owners into a form of voluntary compliance, I suppose?
Yeah, it is a great question. I mean, we've talked a lot about these sort of top-down regulatory structures in place, and you are seeing more increasingly bottom-up efforts from financiers, insurers, charterers to ensure this sort of green recycling. So, and as you say, this sort of voluntary compliance with the Hong Kong Convention, we regularly assist owners in putting together their own ship recycling policy, which is now commonly expected to hold by their banks. Their wider stakeholders expect owners to have this, and that obviously is often more holding yourself to a higher standard of the Hong Kong Convention, despite this not being enforced. In financings, back in 2017, you had a number of banks signing up to the Responsible Ship Recycling Standard, which sort of broadly requires the bank's clients to adopt the IHM Green Passport requirements set out in the Hong Kong Convention and the transposed in the SRR. So you're seeing that banks holding their own clients accountable to this to make sure that they are holding themselves to these standards. The Poseidon principles, which have the overriding aim of increasing transparency are being put in place. My only sort of slight caveat to all this would be that with the sort of general sort of increase in financing from banks, lessors, etc., in the Far East, some of those have a slight less interest in promoting green recycling practices. So I guess there is a bit of a concern that maybe long term this will encourage bad practice from them. But I think generally, as you said, there are those pressures to hold owners to a higher standard than they actually are currently bound by.
James, thanks for that. And I think we're now over time. So I think what I will do, and please don't feel obliged, but if anybody has anything further to add from the panel, do add something now, and then I'll move on to sort of some closing remarks, I suppose. Have we're all completed? We've said everything we want to say. Well, that's no bad thing, and perfectly timed. I think from my perspective, firstly, I'd like to thank James and Anand and Simon. I think it's been a really interesting session. Perhaps we went a bit off piste in certain times, but I think that just demonstrates what a broad subject this is, and the fact that certainly through our events and things, Maritime London should spend a bit more time focusing on this next year as well. So expect some more from us when it comes to sustainable recycling in the not too distant future. I think in general, as we said, it is still a fragmented market on the recycling side. But it feels to me that the market pressures being placed upon ship recycling and the regulatory frameworks that exist are certainly moving it in the right direction. And we are relatively well placed to deal with the demands that are going to be put on the ship recycling market in the future as the shipping industry moves towards a decarbonised future. So I think on that, relatively positive note, it's a good time to close out the session. Again, thanks for everyone for joining. You will get sent this in at some point in the next couple of days once we've had time to tidy it up, etc. And thank you all again for your time. It's been very much appreciated, and thanks again to the panelists wherever you are in the world. I hope you have a very nice day. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.